and then our colleague Samet. Anna, please. Please start.
The football leagues came out. There were lots of lawyers in Portugal, namely the lawyers for Cristiano Ronaldo and the other players identified, explaining that they knew nothing, it was not their fault. But of course, it's very much the fault of the lawyers and all the enablers. And indeed, if FIFA and UEFA do not take measures, they become enablers. They become mafias, and not just about match fixing, but indeed tax fraud and tax evasion. But my question is to Mr. Rangers. Do you have any information whether, in the same way we have had tax authorities cater into multinational corporations in the tax rulings that we have heard in LuxLeaks and elsewhere, whether indeed you have also tax authorities with a blind eye or with a special desk for football players actually conniving as well with this mafia industry defrauding our states. Thank you.
Thank you. So, an Herrn Rangers.
Mr. Rangers, you have 1 minute, please, sir.
Has a special tax desk for soccer players, and I don't think they are part of the mafia, but they are understaffed for sure. It's only it's only 3 or 4 people, and they're fighting against a big industry with a lot of money. So there's an imbalance, but I have no evidence that they are part of the problem. Yeah.
Okay, vielen Dank.
Many thanks. Please, 1 minute.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Many thanks. You regulators are talking about clubs and federations so as to avoid responsibility. I am from Spain. The last 5 presidents of the Barcelona Football Club have either gone to jail, are in jail, or are presently under trial. And the present one is not resigning, but has been in this job for 30 years. And so much money is happening here. There are so many tax havens and so much corruption. How is it possible that a supervisor can go on in power for 30 years and not be corrupted? How do you think that's possible? Who would like to answer? Mr. Retta, please. Well, first of all, whether we know someone is corrupt or not, that something has to be decided on by a court. To my way of thinking, not just in football, but in general, you can only act against people if they have been condemned in a court of law. And where I think you are correct is whether regulations don't need to be changed. When people have been found guilty of tax fraud or other crimes, whether that should not lead to a ban, and whether people should also be excluded from activity as agents. To answer a question that was asked earlier, why can Mendes' app license not be taken away? Because there aren't any more, because FIFA got rid of them in 2015. But what we could do, and what I would like to propose, is whether we could not, as the agents group, try to have a code of conduct that we could agree on these matters on. Thanks. Mr. Silberstein, very quickly.
30 Sekunden maximal.
30 seconds max.
Okay, in relation to your question, I would simply like to stress that back in April 2017, UEFA passed a number of modernizing reforms which were aimed at improving the good governance and the transparency for organization. And amongst these reforms, we introduced term limits for the president of UEFA and the members of the UEFA Executive Committee. There are other important reforms, but I have only 30 seconds, and it's already 30 seconds. Thank you.
Gut, vielen Dank.
Thank you. Mr. Samet, you have 1 minute.
Well, I'd like also myself to pick on one of the teams, the 4 team, in fact, raised by Mr. Rengers, and I think it is also a good opportunity to thank you and people like you, of course, for investigative journalism, because they certainly make our work more comprehensive. You raised the issue of ownership and investment into clubs, and I believe my Spanish colleague has already asked a question in this regard. But even listening to part of the answer about FIFA imposing different requirements and regulatory frameworks on clubs, I would like to expand on that question by stating, would that involve a process of establishing what one would call, even in other spheres, ultimate beneficial ownership? Would one address the question, for instance, of significant ratios, significant percentages of investment? Would one be addressing the question of full tracking and traceability of donations, especially when they exceed significant amounts?
Ja, vielen Dank. Exakt.
Many thanks. That was just 1 minute. Who'd like to say something on ownership?
Frau Morris, please.
Ms. Morris, please.
I think the question deals with requests for FIFA to make additional regulatory rules that would then be imposed. And I think what's important to remember is whenever a new rule or decision is taken by FIFA to apply at an international level, such as third-party ownership, there are then people who seek to challenge the rule, saying that it doesn't accord with their national laws. So that's something that FIFA needs to take into account when making a decision as to whether or not they're going to impose a new rule, which would have far-reaching effects. For example, oftentimes the Court of Arbitration of Sport, which is the court that looks at the FIFA regulations and decides whether or not they're actually applicable on a global level, is something which needs to be taken into account when you're talking about making new regulations. So this is something to always bear in mind when asking for new regulations, whether or not it will be subject to the scrutiny of other international bodies like the Court of Arbitration for Sport.
Okay, good.
Very well. 1 minute for Professor Bent Luca. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to make a distinction between main income coming from football activity and then secondary income that comes from other areas that are then invested elsewhere. Like in the case of Messi, are we basically there talking about primary or reinvested secondary income, where the football leagues basically don't have much to say? Secondly, football players have income that they also have bonuses, and there are other places where there isn't so much room for tax evasion. However, other forms of income, such as from advertising or promotions, ought they to be considered as a main activity, or ought they to be covered in some other way? Thirdly, a question on transfer payments. I don't think that these are necessarily directly taxable. They can rather be considered as a compensation where they would be subject to capital gain tax, and these should not necessarily be covered by income tax. Thank you very much. Ooh, difficult question at the end of the day. Dr. Reiter, please. Many thanks. Well, I didn't find that question actually that difficult. 1 minute answer. On the first question, primary and secondary income streams, I would say that both, investments are invested as well, and you can't necessarily spend all the money you get even as primary income. And then on your second question, in Germany, someone who is employed, it's very difficult to avoid income tax because of the tax system that we have. So it would be in the secondary field that you would have to look for cases of possible fraud. On advertising and promotions, this is considered to be part of basic economic activity, and that means that you have to see what's happening. Basically, that goes back to the federation, and there has to be specific attention paid to the different territories involved in different forms of activity, but it has to be made clear. Transfer payments that you mentioned, this is, I think, not really the right term. We're talking rather compensation for ending a contract before it reaches its initial end date. And when you talk about 500,000 and 1 million amounts, these are considered to be corporate gains in Germany. Many thanks. Let me thank you all warmly, our 4 experts who participated in the panel today. Thank you for making yourselves available and for discussing matters with us. Some questions have remained open, and we would be happy to get further information on these later. We will ask you to answer these. I think the first part of today's hearing is now ended. We are a bit late. We also started 5 minutes too late.